With the release of Deltarune chapters 3 and 4, a lot of interesting discourse has been started online. This can range from newfound candidates for the identity of the knight, the thematic purpose of John Mantle, the dark world of chapter 5, and in my opinion, most interestingly, and the topic of today's video, the ending of chapter 4. It's spawned a lot of conversation that I find to be especially fascinating considering the lack of discussion on specific characters before this release. And one of the main talking points of the ending is the actions of Toriel and whether or not she was neglectful and careless with Chris. So when the title refers to whether the ending is bad or not, I am more so referring to Toriel's actions. Were they bad decisions? Is that clickbait? I don't really know, but what I do know is that I constantly see arguments about this topic that completely remove all the nuance of the situation to label Toriel as a bad mother or completely innocent of any neglect, which I think misses the point of this one scene. But before we get into that, let me give some context. Also, please subscribe. Chapter 4's Dark World ends in a tonal twist that is, all things considered, pretty dark. The Fun Gang just defeated their first Titan and are celebrating their victory. However, that brief moment of relief doesn't last long when Rousey notices that Susie is nowhere to be found. You see, Rousey has been actively trying to prevent Chris and Susie from seeing the real end of the prophecy because he knows something that they don't. Some form of tragic event, probably. He tries to stay one step ahead of them to ensure they don't see what it is. However, when he realizes that Susie is missing, he immediately panics at the realization of what she could see. Despite his best efforts to hide the painful truth from her, she learns the ending, resulting in what I can best describe as the most emotional scene in the entire game for me. Seriously, when I first reached this point, I cried so hard. Watching Rousey panic and stumbling over his words while Susie refusing to accept what she read was just so emotional to me. It's really devastating. Chris and Susie return to the light world and can traverse through it while the most depressing song plays in the background, but can't really do much outside of returning to Chris's home. And once they do, they're greeted by an intoxicated Toriel dancing with an oblivious Sans. Chris is visibly upset by this, and Susie the same. She decides to leave, leaving Chris in a rare moment of them acting completely on their own, taken aback by her words. One following Toriel later, and Chris goes to sleep before we cut to another scene in their room, where they are tossing and turning to try to get sleep despite all the noise the two are making downstairs. One ominous vague comment from Susie outside the window and another vague text message later, and the chapter ends, with a 2026 release date for Chapter 5. So with all that explanation out of the way, what's the actual discussion being had here? Well, the main candidate of blame for this scene is Toriel, Chris's mother. You'll find people arguing that she's a terrible mother who was incredibly neglectful of her child and a friend just to get with a guy she met only a few days ago. And on the other end of the spectrum, you'll see people defending her religiously by saying that she deserves to have some time for herself and it's okay for her to be getting with Sans. Both of these takes, I think, are quite frankly missing the point of this scene heavily. But to really understand why, let's take a second to understand the dynamic and situation between all these characters. Chris is a child of divorced parents, but actively living with their mother, Toriel. She avoids Asgore almost every chance she gets while he is pestering her with flowers and concerns for Azrael's return. He does it not only because he wants the family to be stable for his arrival, but also because he still really loves Toriel. She's recently met a guy at the local grocery store named Sans, and they hit it off almost immediately. Sans and Asgore know each other, but it seems only for the benefit of the pickles that he gives to Asgore. Outside of that, he's visibly uncomfortable with the complicated relations between Toriel and him. Susie comes over to Chris's house after a study session and bakes a pie with Toriel. When Toriel leaves the house to pick up something from her car, she notices the tires are slashed and asks Susie to stay over to ensure her safety. The next day, the three go to church together and enjoy the service, and then after, she lets them go to Noelle's house for a study session as she had plans to practice more at church later that evening. Susie and Chris go into a dark world later and are probably forced to confront the realization realization of their own mortality, only to come home and find Toriel drunk dancing with, as far as Chris is concerned, a complete stranger. And based on the reactions of Chris and Susie, this is probably something they both have experience with. I mean, it's heavily implied that Susie has a poor home life and that Toriel is known to go too far when drinking. So this isn't the first time they've seen something similar to this, most likely. So with all that being said, was Toriel being neglectful? Without a doubt in my mind, yes. But does that make her a bad mother overall? Of course not. I think it should be pretty clear that what Toriel did was objectively wrong. She was under the care of her own child and a child that wasn't even hers. There is a lot of responsibility when someone else's child is under your care, and she clearly didn't do that. No, she was too busy getting drunk with a stranger to notice her kid didn't get home until 1 in the morning. And that isn't even talking about the nickname she gave to Susie, something that was clearly a symbol of a bond between the two, distorted into a moment of reminder of probably her own dysfunctional home, and can make her look at Toriel in a completely different light. I don't think enough to hate her, but enough for it to sting at least a little. She clearly cares about Toriel a lot, considering their own past. And as someone who knows from first-hand experience, it's really hard to accept a person you only saw in a good light as flawed and human, at least in the characteristical sense, not race. And then in the perspective of Chris, it's so obvious how embarrassed they are. It must be a common occurrence enough for them to have an immediate reaction and know what's going on before Toriel even says a word. But despite that, it still bothers them immensely. It's realistic and really relatable. Watching how they immediately walk away in discomfort as Toriel falls to the floor and Sans encouraging her behavior is really unnerving to me. And that's further reinforced by their struggle to fall asleep later. We've almost never seen them this upset at something in the entire game. Minus a weird outlier, but it greatly upsets them. And if you drink so much that your child is visibly uncomfortable to even be around you, then there is definitely a problem. And I haven't even talked about Chris not even knowing Sans well, and neither Toriel. They don't know what he could be like outside of work, and while I don't think Toby would write a character with gross intentions, it's a realistic possibility that Toriel should have considered. And if Deltarune is trying to do anything with writing characters, it's making them realistic. Now, to be fair, I don't think it makes Toriel irredeemable. It's very clear that she still cares for Chris and Susie deeply, and honestly, I think some of the smaller gestures she makes in the chapter were added later to reinforce that theme. Because if anything, the discourse around this scene shows that it could be easily interpreted as her being a bad mom. So I think Toby realized that and added some small details to show their relationship. But even throughout the earlier sections of the game, Toriel is still seen being motherly and looking out for Chris. The reality of the situation is parents fuck up. They're not morally set eldritch creatures that never make a mistake or never make a good decision. They're complicated and are just as human as you and I. Some of you watching might be parents yourself and realized you fuck up sometimes. It's normal. That doesn't mean I think it is a one-time incident, however. As I said, I think it is a somewhat frequent occurrence, but again, you can't define someone's entire identity based on one aspect of who they are. Toriel is a mother who cares about her child and their friends, but is flawed. I think some people really forget the nuance of the scene when trying to either demonize her or paint her as an ideal mother. She's neither, and again, I think she's a scarily accurate representation of a mother with a drinking problem. And then of course, there's Sans, a character who went from being the badass funny skeleton that everyone loved to literally hated overnight. There is definitely less to talk about with him because we don't really know his situation, but he's not entirely innocent either. Honestly, I would go as far to say he's more guilty than Toriel. He has a younger brother whom he left alone to stay with a woman he met only a few days ago, and as far as we know, was sober during the entire interaction. He's never shown with a glass, so he is more responsible for understanding the situation that the kids are put in, and yet he encourages Toriel to keep going with no second thought. It's irresponsible in its own way, I think, and I really hope they give Sans a bit more recovery from this because I think it's a pretty bad look and has drastically changed how people view his character. Not quality-wise, I don't think, but in a sense of likes and dislikes. And with all that being said, I think I've made my point. I believe Toriel really messed up as a parent and neglected her child and friend, drank too much, and let a stranger into her house whom she only knew for a few days. But she's a complicated character that shouldn't just be written off as only that quality. And I also believe that Sans really fucked up too with his own neglect and encouraging toxic behaviors. I made this video because I felt like expressing some of my gripes with the takes that have surfaced over this scene and how quite frankly, misguided they can be. And I hope this gives some of you a different perspective on that ending and can understand the layers of these characters. Thank you all so much for watching and sticking around to the end, and thank you to anyone who's been keeping up with my channel so far. I have quite a few videos planned and some I've already started scripts for, so hopefully they should be ready shortly. Bye bye for now.